So Brad, we've hit record, so we're ready when you are. Brad?
Oh, sorry, we are on mute here. Sorry. Steve, you're good to go then too?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. Well, it looks like we've got a number of people that have joined us. It looks like we've got some folks from Cedar City, a number of folks from our National Fire Center in Boise, a couple of people strung out around Salt Lake City itself. So with that, I'm excited to have Steve join us. And I know many of you have seen his most recent book, To the Last Smoke, The Interior West of Fire Survey, and kind of looks at fire from the Sierra Front across Nevada through Utah into the and the Wasatch Front to the Colorado Front Range. And we had Steve do a similar webinar when we had the Western Regional Strategy Committee joining us in Utah about a month ago. And that really seemed to be a success. The only thing we forgot to do was record that. So we thought maybe we'd try this one more time and, you know, maybe a little more Utah specific with that. And I know at the Western Regional Strategy Committee, we handed out 70 of these books. And then for Utah BLM hitting 1 million acres, kind of as a prize, we gave out the book to individuals that had a significant contribution to that. So with that, Jennifer, do you have anything to add? And then we'll turn it over to Steve.
Nope, I think that's good. We're ready.
Okay, well, Steve, go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, good morning, and let me apologize in advance. I've been fighting a virus the last week. It's receding, but I still have some coughing, and I'll apologize in advance if I interrupt. Well, this is one part of a large project that's gone on several years. It began in a conversation with Lincoln Bramwell, who's the chief historian of the Forest Service, about the need to update the general history of fire in the U.S. Fire in America, my earlier big book, ended in the 1970s, and a lot's happened. So we felt we really needed to bring it up to date. And in talking about it, we decided we'd go about it with two books. And one book, this would be jointly funded, by the way, it was, with the Forest Service, Interior, and Joint Fire Science who wanted to contribute a little as well. So one book would be the play-by-play, that is the big narrative, who did what, when, and it would start 1960. Forest Service is pretty much a hegemon in ways that really hard to recapture today. And then things really began changing, policy, institutional arrangements, everything. So Between Two Fires, which was published almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, tells this, tells the story from 1960. It was going to end at the centennial of the big blow-up, 2010, but the fires just kept rolling on. So it goes up, it peters out finally in 2013. But I wanted a second book to go with that would capture some of the details and peculiarities. So I thought of To the Last Smoke as a kind of colored commentary. And this project just ran away, just bolted out of the canal and went all over the place. And instead of having a few essays to highlight some regional characteristics, it began to self-organize into regions. And the obvious big three, Florida, California, the Northern Rockies, we would keep these, say, 55 to 60,000 words, that is under 200 pages, relatively short, accessible. They would have a kind of format, introduction, what is distinctive about this particular region, why should we care about it, and then ending with the region between two fires, that is, putting it into sort of the national narrative. So the Great Plains has always had its own sort of regional culture. Wanted to get that. I knew the Southwest. I wanted to get that. That turned out to be harder than I thought. So the remaining ones, the Interior West is out. The other 3 volumes are all written. They're in production. Here and there, the last one will be out in the fall. And then early next spring, maybe February, the Northeast, and a volume called Slopovers, which has many surveys for the Mid-American oak woodlands, the Pacific Northwest, and Alaska. So that's the whole suite, and there are no plans to do anything more. 10 books, I'm through. So the Interior West, I've always been intrigued by this. I've lived in Arizona. I worked the North Rim. My wife's from southern Utah. I always wondered why it didn't loom larger in the national story. And this is pretty much where I define it, as Brad indicated. But for the most part, it's been defined by its surrounding regions. There's the Great Plains. Okay, that's a well-defined region. The Northern Rockies, the Northwest, California, the Southwest. And in many ways, the Interior West has been a kind of hole in the donut. And that's been true for the national narrative, and true in many ways for the geography, the political geography of fire, until more recent times. And now it is coming back into prominence. Of course, cheatgrass, the sage grouse are a big reason, but not only. There are bunches of things. And I find this very satisfying because, basically being a historian, I see the whole story beginning in Utah with the Powell Survey, which in many ways inaugurates, it's our first map of fires. It's the first time we have scientists examining fires in the West, in fact, for the country, and that became the basis for many other maps and studies. So there was a sense in which we may be coming full circle. So I found that going about it, however, so dispersed that it was very hard to pull together. My preferred means has been to sort of do long road trips, and this was really hard because they're really long road trips if you're going to put these pieces together. But they were just too scattered. So in many ways, the book became more structured internally than most of the volumes. You have things in common, looking for ways to sort of create a kind of parallelism. 3 front ranges, all of them very distinctive with different kinds of responses. 3, what we might call problem species. Cheatgrass, juniper, mountain pine beetle, the ones I selected to go with each of the 3 parts, but of course they spill over elsewhere. But I thought that got at the issues well enough. And then I identified 2 sort of pivot sites to go between states. The Arizona Strip, in some ways the Area 51 of fire research, I think. And then Mesa Verde National Park, which turned out to be much more interesting than I had anticipated. So that sort of gives you the basic internal design. And of course, each of the states, or the parts of the states that I look at, has very distinctive origin stories. So which make interesting the question of how politically and historically they join the rest of the country. So what did I find most interesting? Let me suggest some stuff fairly briefly, and then we can open this up for questions. Might be a lot more interesting for all of you. The Great Basin really is a sink, and not just for water. It's filled and emptied not only with water and then salt, but with species and with peoples. And the way in which that happens, I think, makes it very difficult for us to understand. In some ways, it's still coming out of the last ice age. It makes it very difficult to understand. I find the coevolution of rangeland science with all of the exotics that have filled in the Great Basin over the last century is a very interesting intellectual problem as well as a practical one. Mesa Verde really, it's a kind of archaeological Southern California. I looked at what they were doing or trying to do or allowed to do, which isn't a lot. And basically aggressive initial attack, knowing that they're going to lose some, and when they lose them, they're going to lose them big, take out whole mesas at a time, evacuate the place. And you think this is really an irrational approach. But then that's very much what Southern California has opted for a similar reason, that this is a kind of real high-intensity WUI, except that it was laid down 1,000 years ago. And because of the archaeological concerns, there's almost nothing they can do. So that struck me as a very interesting issue. That was fun. The Colorado Front Range, the problems with big fires that have occurred along there in the 21st century, and the solution Colorado has taken. Utah may have been scarred by its fires and adopted a kind of catastrophic fire program. Colorado was scared by them as well as scarred. And they've gone to what I would think of as a CAL FIRE light model. They've turned it, it's defined now as a matter of public safety. It's turned over basically to urban fire. And they're trying to find ways to do it in less costly forms than California does, experimenting with all kind of aviation and high-tech stuff. But fundamentally, they are not going at land use. They are not dealing with fire codes. They are not dealing with lots of other issues that you'd think that you would need to solve it. And instead, they're going to go with a real high-intensity initial attack. Or as one fire officer put it, they're going to a 10 p.m. policy. It should be out before the day's over. So that was very interesting, and in some ways a warning light sounding where the WUI issue might go if it's lost, if it is taken away from land management agencies and simply goes urban. And some places, like the Front Range, all the factors that are involved there are such that there may be no real alternative. But I think that's a sad way because ultimately, until you control the landscape, you don't really control fire. And in Colorado, it's all carrots and no sticks, and they don't want to impose some kind of political solution, which is ultimately, I think, the only way they can deal with it. But that's a very interesting story, and it will be fascinating to see how it plays out. Great Basin National Park, fascinating story there. I was interested with the fires that burned into bristlecone pines at the top and laid introduced questions about fire in deep time. That was a fun inquiry. And then Utah and Utah's role in sort of the larger national fire cycle. And so let me very briefly suggest, the first map we have of fires comes out of Powell's Arid Lands report. It was issued in 1878, but the more famous edition was quickly reissued a year later. And Powell was very explicit about the role of fire. His crews mapped fire as one of 4 categories of land use, essentially from the edge of the deserts where fuel's thickened enough to carry fire up to the flanks of the high plateaus. They also identified the primary source being American Indian. Some of this because tribes are being pushed into new lands, so they're using fire to make new landscapes habitable and so forth. A very interesting discussion, and this would come back a dozen years later when the country is debating what kind of forest reserve policy to enact. And Powell, who was then head of the U.S. Geological Survey, which was by far the largest scientific bureaucracy in the federal government, sort of crashed the discussion in the Interior Department and argued in favor of a kind of indigenous burning, which he said was very different than the kind of burning we're seeing that's causing destruction, which is so much of it is tied with land clearing, logging, and that became, I'm sure, the source for the derogatory phrase Paiute forestry, which was later became a fundamental part of a discussion after 1910 whether we should base our management policies on lighting fires or fighting them. So Powell and the Utah experience was really fundamental right at the start. So what else can we talk about? What else did I find particularly interesting? I'd been interested in the Powell Survey for a long time. I'd written a biography of Gilbert, actually, one of its members, but always from the history of science and primarily geology. So I'd always looked at the high plateaus, most of the region, with geologic eyes, and this time I needed to go back and look more ecologically. And it was really a different landscape, and that was fun, fun to do, but it also confirmed for me the need to actually go out and do stuff and see what it's like on the ground, and not just go from text and inherited literature. Wasatch Front, clearly different than the other two front ranges, much less severe. It offered because the prevailing winds are going to push the fire up the mountain, not down it into settlements, but nonetheless distinctive in fun ways, and a series of canyons there provided a kind of historical way of thinking about the evolving fire program. I hadn't seen canyons lined up in that way before. That was useful. Aspen, I'd always thought of aspen as just sort of part of the vignettes on the wallpaper. Not really a keystone species, not a charismatic species, something that's sort of temporary between the main players. And I really had to reevaluate all of that. Aspen is a keystone species. How can we rethink of aspen? The longevity of some of the clones, I mean, astonishing. So that was interesting, to reconsider aspen and to look at the way in which aspen is sort of reclaiming a place in the landscape and in fire ecology that had not been there before. And one of the saddest parts for me, but important, was the issues raised on settlement narrative. Most of the American West, we think of all the environmental ills that came out of the sort of explosive American settlement in the western states as really a result of sort of arrogance, violence, greed, extreme individualism, just sort of people sort of wrecking things and leaving the future to pick up the pieces and pay the costs. But Utah has always, because of the long and fundamental Mormon settlement, offered a very different narrative. It's one of a sort of communitarian ethos, which was also, by the way, influential in Powell's thinking and his arguments for sort of state-sponsored conservation. But really different sort of sets of motives and purposes. And yet, when you look at it, the results seem to be pretty similar. Now, not all of the Utah settlement was the result of sort of close Mormon communities and systematic colonization. There are lots of others running around and flocks and herds coming and going, miners coming and going. There's lots of other stuff going on. But nonetheless, uniquely in the West, this was a kind of community-based settlement, which at least in principle rejected most of the bad character traits that we think of as leading to all these nasty environmental ills. And to have in some ways the same thing happen here was very revealing, and makes me want to re-examine what it was about contact that really resulted in these changes. And then Utah, I'll give you credit. I had no idea Utah was prepared to enact the principles of the National Cohesive Strategy into law. the only state to do so. It would not have ranked very high in my projected states to do this, and that was fascinating to see it happen, and a real point of positive infection, I think, for your surrounding states. Discussed earlier when the Western region was meeting, what it would take, and I think over the West, the dominant player so far and away is California, that it will really take California to follow Utah's example before we could get major movement, and that would change the national story. In lieu of that, Utah suggests ways in which local communities and states could respond. That was totally unexpected, and that was happening as I was researching it. So I can excuse myself a little for not knowing in advance, but this is also another reason why you just have to go and actually see what's happening. So let's see, I think that's it. So then the book ends. Sort of we come full circle, the interior West between two fires, trying to restore the region to a national narrative, putting it back in, giving it its rightful place in part of the larger mosaic, historically and politically and geographically with respect to fire. So with that, let me stop and open it to questions, or I don't know if anyone has read or sampled the book, but if you have, I'd be interested in what you found interesting. And Brad, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so we've unmuted everybody, and you can hear me well? Fine?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Okay. So does anybody, I know we've got about 14 or so plus people on the call. Any questions from out in the field? And if not, I've got a whole host of questions. So
Okay.
I thought about sending them around so it wasn't just like one person asking questions, but, and I don't know if any of you guys have any questions, but, I know in the book you paint a rather dark perspective on cheatgrass within the Great Basin in the Nevada chapter. Do you think there's any hope in the future for cheatgrass or getting rid of it?
Yeah, there are several options, and I don't have a solution. I would like to say, having researched this now, I'm not a scientist, but having looked at it historically, thinking about how the problems have evolved and so forth, there's a way forward. I really don't. I think it's a case of stabilizing until something, and containing, if you will, a containment strategy until something else may manifest, and something does. I mean, the history of the Great Basin over the last 2.5 million years is of constantly emptying and filling, and under basically climate change, and climate change is continuing, and we will see that happen again. Clearly, the issue is that the destruction of the native perennial grasses and the vacant niches that were made available, and they're filling. The cheatgrass really very successfully filled it. But also talking to people and looking at the research, there are a lot of other nasty exotics out there, and cheatgrass is not the worst. And the really awful scenario for the future is that we look back on the time of cheatgrass as a relatively benign period compared with what replaced it. So I think the first issue is simply not letting something worse replace it, and then gradually try to contain and work with it. But I don't see, there are a lot of other areas where fire restoration, or in this case the need to eliminate fire, is fairly clear. Comes with guidelines, scientifically informed, historically sensible guidelines about what we can do. It's a case of actually applying it here. I don't think that kind of clarity exists.
Okay. I know we've got both our smoke management coordinator, that's an interagency position, and then we've also got our air quality specialist in the state office here. But from a historical context, a lot of times we try to discuss about using past fire history to negotiate our ability to burn in regards to air quality standards. What are your feelings towards this, and have you seen any successes in using some of the historical data to justify?
Yeah, I'd sure like to say, hey, this is a clear case where history can help you do your job. I'm not sure that's going to be the case, because people don't want smoke in the air, whether it existed historically or not. And historical arguments like that was a part of the natural scene. If it's not in a wilderness area, an area that's committed to being what its natural conditions were, people I don't think will accept that any more than they will accept that, well, smallpox was historically important. So, it becomes a matter of public health, and it's becoming more and more an issue. And stuff in the American West and even lightly inhabited areas are now being tainted by heavy smoke episodes in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world, where really public health concerns about smoke, several orders of magnitude worse than anything we've got in the West, are really driving it. So I'm not sure that's going to be successful. I think the issue is that you can get away with some smoke in, as I say, natural areas, even national parks, wilderness areas where we have to maintain the most pristine quality. There's a case that this is part of it, and it's part of the ecology, and we need some of it. Outside that, I think that's a very hard argument, and we need to be thinking about ways of managing the smoke better. My sense in the West is that despite the successes of prescribed fire, it is not a foundational strategy in the same way it is in the Southeast, and particularly in Florida. And I don't think it will become. It is so. It is too encumbered. It's become too complicated, too expensive. So there's certainly a place for it, but in the larger management of these landscapes, we seem to be going to a kind of box and burn approach, some kind of managed wildfire, whatever we think about that. And I think I'm fascinated by this because I think it's a hybrid strategy. If you do it right, it's half suppression and half prescribed burn. And we could do our burnouts a lot better than we do in many cases. Instead of thinking about it as emergency backfiring, think about this as kind of urgent prescribed burns. How would we do this if we were trying to minimize the damage or maximize ecological effects of our own burning as well as the wildfire? And if you back off and pick your slots, you may have some opportunity to do that. Now, one of the side benefits, the reason I'm bringing this up now is that one of the side benefits I see of this is that it also puts some levies, some borders on smoke, that it's not just going to sit there and smoke away for weeks. It's an actively managed area where you are going to have pulses of smoke and then have better control over what goes. I think these really long, lingering smokes, even in areas that are tolerant of fire restoration, places like Missoula, where you've got these valleys and regular inversions, and their tolerance for being smoked in summer after summer, month after month will wear thin. So I think some option of this, and part of it is not just to get the fire there, but to handle the smoke a little better.
I know with the box and burn, I mean, one example you used was the saddle fire down on the Dixie, and questioning whether or not we could actually continue doing something that with, burning, a little over 2,000 acres for over $10 million.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is really a powerful technique. I think it's the future. When I'm optimistic, I think we can adapt this to be the future of fire, primarily in the West. But I think we really need some guidelines and the agencies need to step up. It's not just that it's tolerated and people are out there making choices on the ground and doing what they can, but they really need some guidelines. You know, what kinds of limits are there? How can we think about spending money, calling away resources for how long, so that people can be rewarded when they operate it well, and you know, can be chastised if they do it badly. But right now we don't have guidelines, and some of these are going to fail in politically unhappy ways, and we need to be prepared for that so we don't lose the technique altogether. So if I were in the field, a fire officer, I would want clearer guidelines. Yeah, I want to be able to use this, and I want to be able to experiment and do stuff, but there have got to be some larger constraints put on this so that when it fails, I can say I stayed within the rules.
And I know you also brought up the point about, you know, prescribed burning in the West may not be the same solution that it is in the Southeast, and I think I'd concur with that, especially with Utah and with the BLM, as far as, you know, we do have air quality issues, and sometimes that hinders us, but I think we have greater issues with, you know, the threat of cheatgrass invading areas we're burning, pinyon juniper encroachment, and really, you know, that's a dynamic fuel model, and hard to get the type of fire behavior you want to get rid of that. Also, when we're wanting to burn, you know, a lot of our resources are still up in northern Idaho or other places in the West, so that has been an issue for us, and we've gone from, you know, when I first got here, probably about a 50-50 split between mechanical and prescribed burning to we're like in the 2 to 5% range per year of our acres burnt or acres treated. So
yeah, I think some kind of managed wildfire is the only way you're going to get the acreage, but we could do a lot more advanced planning on that. I mean, we used to have pre-attack zones for fires that might escape. You could flip that around and have the equivalent. Okay, if we've got fires in these areas, what are the places where we could burn out? How do we do this smart so that we don't create more smoke issues, and we can do the burning so we're not, you know, incinerating places? This could be a kind of hybrid fire. If I ran the zoo, if you will, I would be thinking about putting a lot of research money into those questions.
Putting money into research questions as far as more of the box and burn technique, and
yeah.
Okay.
And how to rebuild, and then, you know, how do we rebuild? We're getting large fires. How do we rebuild landscapes out of those large burns? I mean, you know, you think, wow, you just had 400,000 acres burned or something, not in cheatgrass, you know, but it's going to be patchy, and you know, there are opportunities. The next year, you think, you know, you could burn out some of those areas under relatively controlled conditions. This is the time to do it. How do we follow up? How do we build new landscapes out of these large fires? So I think there are a different set of questions. In many ways, we spent 50 years after 1910 trying to put out all fires, and then we've spent 50 years trying to put good fires back in. And the model for that restoration was really out of Florida. It was underburning. You know, with sort of lavish fuels and rich understories and the rest, and none of that doesn't make sense in the Great Basin, where you've got cheatgrass as a problem. The whole fuels dynamic is different. It's become too expensive, too encumbered with liability issues. We're just not getting it done. But if we're going to go this other approach, then let's be really serious about it, and let's put some intellectual discipline into it. Let's create some guidelines for folks so they're not going to be hurt if and when things go wrong. And everything fails at some point, so there will be some failures, and we should be anticipating that. And how are we responding? Because I don't see a plan B if this approach fails. We're just locked into a suppression story, which we can't sustain, and a prescribed fire option, which we can't really impose. So I think this is the future. I think we've sort of flipped 50 years, all suppression, only suppression, 50 years trying to restore good fire, and now I think we're into this kind of mashup, kind of a mashup era, and we should be prepared to be inventive, but I think within some kind of constraints.
Well, thanks. I don't want to dominate the conversation. Any other questions? We got one here from one of our listeners.
So a question we have, the next 2 days we're about to have a resource advisor course with participants that are all throughout the Intermountain West, different agencies. Probably not a big fire background, and you hopefully might be familiar with the role of a resource advisor on a fire assignment.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess the question to you, you have a chapter, basically the Sync for Exotics, and that's probably good information to share. But for those folks who are probably going to be going out as resource advisors, do you have any message based on the research you've done over time, or some key points that we'd want to share with those folks to give them a better understanding of the history of fire, the impacts on resources potentially, and information to help them do a better job in that role as a resource advisor?
Well, that's a great question, and it requires a more systematic approach that I can give you right now. But let me suggest a couple of points for people, particularly who don't come from a fire background. One is that fire is fundamental to life on Earth. I mean, as soon as terrestrial life took root on the continents, it burned, and it's been burning ever since. And yet fire is not a part of most resource management training. We think, well, sure, it is here in the West, but we're talking about a handful of places that teach it through natural resources schools, and it's not embedded in biology, which I find absolutely astonishing. It's not a part of intellectual understanding. That disappeared a couple of 100 years ago. So they make what most people see of fire, they see it as a disaster, and they see it as a threat. And it can be. There are certainly cases where that's true. But part of it is just getting the understanding that it's okay if stuff burns. Just trying to educate people back into a familiarity so that the default position is not instant suppression. Or if we're going to allow some fire, to do it as little as possible. We've tried the cautious approach, and what we're getting is feral fire instead. So it's going to burn, and we need to be more aggressive in thinking about ways to get that burning done. And I think we need to be more tolerant. We're going to have areas that are going to be more severely burned than we like. But the trade-off may be that we get other areas burned with a level that we find acceptable. So I think part of it is just sort of a philosophical position that they probably don't come at fire. They don't see it as a part of the tradition. It is just something that comes in outside and causes problems. The phrasing I like to use is that all the other ancient elements, earth, air, and water, all have academic disciplines devoted to their study, even whole departments. But the only fire department on a university campus is the one that sends emergency vehicles and alarm sounds. We still don't have a place for fire. So they need to think about, I would urge them to think about fire more broadly, and to show perhaps a little more tolerance. And the other thing is to be more clear about dividing those assets that are clearly at risk. We're talking about human communities, municipal watersheds, really high value built landscape, or even ecological landscapes that might be sensitive to bad fires. Distinguishing between those and other landscapes that can tolerate and indeed need fire. And let's not construct one solution for both. They're different. They require different approaches and different thoughts. Other than that, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to advise. I wish there was a better. I could produce a handbook for you. But I think those are the things that I see recurring, and I'm constantly surprised. I teach a course on fire. It's just called Fire. It's in the biology department. It's sort of an accident that I'm there, and they're willing to let me do it. And I asked the student, the program has a big conservation biology component. That's where I get students. But I asked them, these are seniors for the most part, how much they have heard about fire in their career as a biology major. And most of them have never had anything to do with fire. Maybe somewhere in a textbook they heard about the Yellowstone fires of '88, and there may be something on that. But otherwise, it is simply not part of the curriculum. It's not part of our cultural understanding. It's changing, but that I think is something to overcome. So people come into resources, they may not have the background you and I think they should, or surely by now people have got the message, but they haven't. And I'm hopeful that in some ways that the whole concept of an Anthropocene and human influence is forcing us to re-examine the human role in structuring the planet. And that, I think, is forcing a re-examination of fire as a part of that. And if we can at least get that, I'm sorry, I'm going academic on you here, but I think that's the fundamental thing is I tend to think, wow, we solved this 50 years ago. We got the message out. We changed fundamental policies. People get this. And after Yellowstone, surely everybody's got it. That was 30 years ago. Generations have come and gone since then. This is established. It isn't. So that is part of it. And then I think just sort of accept variability, and that we're going to be managing different parts of fires for different reasons, and they require different techniques. So.
Well, Justin, who heads up our riparian program, is taking a page worth of notes on that one response. So
we'll be sure to share it. So I appreciate that.
Well,
anybody else?
Useful. Yeah.
Anybody else out there have any questions? Was someone chiming in there?
There's a question in the chat box from Paul Corrigan.
Okay.
Can you see that, or would you like me to read it?
I'm just getting in there, but okay. So Paul, who's our smoke management coordinator, interagency-wise, his question is: rapid initial attack and full suppression strategies are being applied both to WUI fires with structures threatened and to remote sage-grouse habitat. What kinds of what kind of parallels and differences do you see in the two landscapes?
Yeah. Clearly, they require different techniques. I think defending structures, preparing this. I really wish. Well, let me back. Okay, so there are obviously different techniques in that. I think at this point, we're stuck with a kind of rapid initial attack. But I would be thinking about, and I'm sure most of you are doing it for sage-grouse habitat and cheatgrass infested areas. Where can we make a stand without allowing it to spread and do more damage than we've already got? I'm not sure. Yeah, this is a great question. I'm sorry. I'm going to appeal to residual virus issues. I can't cough my way through it, but let me back up a little here. They seem on the surface to be the same problem, and there are some superficial ways in which they are the same problem in that they require protection, and they depend really on controlling the environment, on controlling the landscape. And we clearly need to put more, to have local communities invest more in their own protection. Sage grouse are not going to be able to invest in the protection of their habitat, so we have to do that for them. But I'm not sure that a similar kind of just all-out response is always the best. And we're at that point, we're back to Brad's opening question about cheatgrass, and I don't see a solution. I'd like to say there's something, we do this and we begin unwinding it, and we'll have the problem fixed. I think we do bunches of things, and we hope that over the future we get a bit smarter, we contain the problem, that if things come in that replace cheatgrass, or cheatgrass begins to recede, we can fill those niches with something more benign. Other than that, I don't think there's an easy solution. There's no reason why we have communities burning. We solved the problem of houses burning a long time ago, and we just forgot to do it. It's like watching diseases come back. It's like watching measles return or something. Hey, don't you know about vaccinations? Don't you know about basic sort of public health issues? Well, we sort of did, and we decided we didn't need it anymore. It's coming back. So the other thing I would say about the WUI is that we've defined this as a wildland problem with houses in it, and it could just as easily be defined as an urban problem with peculiar landscaping. And if you define it as an urban fire problem, the solutions are pretty clear. You solve it as little bits of cities, and you take control over the landscaping. I mean, I live in a place, not a particularly threat from fire, but code requires that if you've got tumbleweeds and weeds growing up in your untended vacant lot, you're responsible for removing that. And that's a pretty clear set of guidelines. And the WUI should be in the same category. So in some ways, I find that as a misdefined problem. The sage grouse and cheatgrass issue is really hard to know how to define it in a similar way or to redefine it, because I go back to this long history of the Great Basin, this sort of rising and falling of filling and emptying that goes on, and now the current set is really not much to our taste. But I feel pretty confident that the larger process is going to continue. That is a different set of challenges. That's a lot harder. I don't really have a solution to that. The WUI thing, it just always struck me as a dumb name for a dumb problem. We solved this problem a long time ago. We just forgot.
Well, appreciate that question, Paul. Anybody else out there with questions? Well, I know we've got a couple of listeners listening in from Color Country, and that's Cedar City, which their district actually extends over into the Henry Mountains. And I know you talked a little bit about the Henry Mountains, and we are looking at doing some planning efforts there. And just last week, I finished reading the book, and Utah first, and then I came around and finished up with the Arizona Strip. And are there any correlations that could be made with what happened within the Arizona Strip and the Henry Mountains, seeing that their remoteness and have some similar ponderosa pine type communities in that?
I'm not sure I would make that leap. I'd be prepared to leave them on their own, just treat them as they are. We know some general things about ponderosa pine, the Southwest. We know some of the region. I think the two histories have been somewhat different. The isolation matters, but in some ways, the isolation is in some ways a construct of history. that we've made them more isolated perhaps than before. I was really surprised at the potential fire history that seemed to emerge out of the Henrys, and the role of Native peoples in that, if I'm reading it correctly. I'm not sure I have a set of guidelines. I'm willing to tell you here. I studied this. Here's what you need to do. I'm not sure that's the case. I think we need to do things, but we also need to do it boldly with humility. We have had so many mistakes. So many times we have decided, okay, we got the science. We now have a new set of data that tells us what to do. Here's how we fix it. And we've gone in and we said, oh, wait, it's connected to a whole bunch of other things we didn't appreciate. Now we've got another problem. So I think we need to get fire back in, but with a certain kind of, there was an old Latin phrase, hasten slowly, and that might seem to apply as well. And let me back up that part of it, I hope people are not going into these books with the idea that they are prescriptive and that they will tell you what you need to do. Here I'm solving the problem. I'm reclassifying the problem. I'm telling you what it is, and here's how you fix it. My effort here is to try to put fire back as a part of our culture, part of our national story, and to find ways in which fire interacts with all these other kinds of things that we may not even think about being fire related. But that's part of the same problem I face in my fire class with students who come at it from sciences, even biological sciences, that have never studied fire. Most of the culture is not familiar with fire. I'm trying to create ways in which we can begin putting fire, restoring fire and the narrative fire back into our national culture, back into basic discourse, so people interested in other topics may realize that there's a fire component here too, and that's interesting and worth studying. So in some places I might be able to advise you. I might come away with a sense of this is what you're going to have to do, or this is what I would do. Other places, I just think it's a series of bold but cautious experiments.
Okay. Well, I have one last question, and it's the same question I asked last time, but before I close, I wanted to make sure we don't have anybody else that, Jennifer, does your group have any questions or anybody else out there?
Yeah, I've got one from Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Dr. Pyne, as you've been writing these books and going through different states, I'm assuming you've been trying to capture data as far, that relates to fuels or fires. Can you speak to the data that's helpful and how potentially important it is for us to be collecting fire history data, and then maybe speak a little bit to what would have made your life easier or made a better story if the data was collected in a different way?
Wow, those are great questions. And again, it goes back to the core of what say history can do and where we can contribute. And a lot of people would look to history and say, well, we'll get data. The past is full of information, full of data, and we just need to mine that and run it through our algorithms, and it will make things better. And part of what I've come away with is the sense that that's probably not going to happen because much of the past is not stored in a way that we can easily capture and quantify and use. And part of it is the fact that there is so much change, that the past is a very rough guide. In fact, there are now people so impressed with the growth of the Anthropocene that they are arguing for a no analog future, that the past is just irrelevant. It doesn't tell us anything because we are leaving that and those worlds so far behind us so rapidly that trying to use those as a baseline is just going to make things worse. So I'm not to there yet. I think we can learn a lot from the past. I don't think that the kind of data I hear you asking about is going to be there. I don't know of any place that's got enough. What they have, where prescribed fire, for example, works best is where you have a culture that never gave it up, that has changed it, adapted it to new conditions, but never gave it up. And you do it because it's the right thing to do, and we figure out the data afterwards. What I have found, I have not found any place that really had the kind of statistics I would have liked. We have really awful statistics in fire, basically burned area, numbers of fires, and costs. And it's very hard to break those down into more meaningful categories. We have pretty poor metrics for understanding fire effects, partly because this is where the National Fire Plan went. We use fuel as a universal metric, but in some ways that's silviculture by other means. And most of the big fire problems in most of the country is not a fuel problem. Grass is a great example. I mean, how is this a fuel problem? How do you treat fuels in that way? So we're stuck with it as a metric, but not a very useful metric. Most of what we want are ecological questions: biodiversity, watershed, ecological goods and services, aesthetics, public health issues. These are not issues that really a fuels-dominated, fuels-informed program gets at. And it causes some dissonance, I think, when you talk with critics, many of them environmental critics, who are looking at a landscape that they don't see parsed up as blocks of hydrocarbon. They see all kinds of other things out there, and they're concerned about fire interacting with all these other things. And yet the only metric we really have that seems to be encoded is in fuels. So I've not found the fuels issue to be particularly helpful. What I do find is that there are common elements, fire problems across the country, and the replacement of grasslands with woody vegetation is certainly one. East, southeast, northwest, everywhere. That seems to be a universal concern. Always has a local accent, but that's sort of pretty universal. In fact, I've sort of reached the point that it's harder to find new topics because I'm reaching the same things are starting to recycle. What I think is missing, though, out of that, and I really saw this when I was looking at the Mid-American Oak Woodlands area, which was really quite fun and interesting for me, is that it's not just a fuel and fire issue. And that even if you want to drive back some of the woody invasives, and they've got all these mesification, they call it, all these shade trees coming in and replacing species. How to do that, and they're trying to use fire to do it. And the dynamic, so much fuel, so much fire set at the right time, drives back, will kill, burn up, these kinds of things just doesn't work. And it struck me that what's missing there are obviously biological elements. There are other biological agents that are interacting with fire to change and to shape these systems. And we've taken, in a sense, the biology out of ecology, and we're trying to reduce it to almost a form of silviculture measured by fuels. And that has its place. It's certainly useful in built environments and other locals areas, but I don't think it is getting it. And some of what's missing with our fire and fuel projects, yeah, we can reduce it, but are we really getting the ecological effects we want? Maybe there are other things interacting, some of which are gone. Maybe bears were really important in Florida in the past for interacting with some of the palmettos and other things. Maybe passenger pigeons which were so important in the ecology of the oak woodlands until they were driven into extinction, are part of the missing ingredient here. Maybe there are other species that interact in ways, and that's what I think. That's what I think intellectually is missing in our depictions of fire ecology. And I didn't see a lot of research into that. I kept finding little oddball things which suggested ways in which we forget that fire is a product of the living world, and we're trying to reduce it to a kind of physical model. And I think that causes issues for us. So that's not really solving your issue. It's suggesting that maybe there's another way to redefine these issues. I would like, instead of having them the choice of we have to either do it this way or that way, we have to estimate it here, evaluate it there, and so forth. Why can't we have parallel systems that we pull out for different purposes? And I think a fully biological model is part of what's missing intellectually. And I think that's where our fuel metric, I mean, I understand we want a quantitative measure. We want something that connects, we can measure in fires with in flame, combustion, and all this sort of thing. But that's really not solving the larger issue of fire on the land. That's fine if we're talking about WUIs. The rest of it, no. And we don't really have a set of measures to do that.
Well, thanks. And that pretty much kind of answered the last two questions, or the last two answers. Beers answered my question as far as how do we use, some of this historical information to, project us to the past or to the future. And I think that does that. So, any last questions by folks? If not, this was being recorded, so I'm guessing that Jennifer and Buck will get us how to access this recording if you want to share with others. And do appreciate your time, Steve, for taking an hour of your time to share a little bit about what you were able to.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. And I hope that I'm trying to provide, we all have to contribute where we can. My contribution, I think, is to try to connect fire with the larger culture and issues in ways that maybe we don't always appreciate. So I'll thank everyone for their time and attention, and wish you well with the coming season.
Well, thanks. And I know Utah State was looking at possibly getting you up there for the Restoring the West conference. Have you been talked to by them yet, or?
Yeah, we talked about it, but I can't balance the dates they've got with my teaching schedule.
Okay, well that's unfortunate, but
yeah, I was already committed to another conference a couple weeks from that, and I can't rearrange classes.
Okay, well, unfortunate, but do appreciate the book and you discussing it with us.
Okay, my pleasure. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.